The scene here is one of horror and bewilderment. No one seems to know exactly what happened, but certainly at least 4 houses have disappeared in a smoke and flame. At the present moment, rescue services are trying to take injured and dead to the town hall where a refugee centre has been set up. A helicopter is circling the scene at the moment, and police, ambulances and firemen are still tackling flames in an area of the town called Sherwood Crescent, where the houses were demolished. Apparently the aircraft has hit a hill about 3 miles from Lockerbie, and then wreckage has been strewn as it travelled the distance to the town and landed on the houses and some other property.
Bert Houston of the BBC with an eyewitness report of what's going on there, and it does sound like a scene of great horror indeed as the Pan Am flight, a 747, flight number 103, crashed with a great explosion tonight on the border between England and Scotland in the town of Lockerbie. He also mentioned the village of Sherwood Crescent, saying that it appeared that 4 houses had simply disappeared in smoke and in flames. There were earlier reports of cars on fire as well on a nearby highway that has now been closed. That's all the information that we have at this hour. About 250 people on board, perhaps as many as 258, including 3 children. Pan Am Flight 103, a 747, headed for New York for the holidays, no doubt. It went down 303 miles outside of London. We'll have a complete wrap-up tonight on NBC Nightly News, and as additional information becomes available to us, we'll report that to you on this NBC station. For now, I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News, New York.
This has been an NBC News special report. We now rejoin the program already in progress.
KPRC-TV, Houston. We now join our regularly scheduled program.
What am I going to do with a letter of apology? I don't want a letter, I want a refund.
British officials are expected to announce that they have determined the cause of the crash of Pan Am Flight 103 last Wednesday. Sources tell NBC News that examination of a suitcase and pieces of wreckage lead to the conclusion that a bomb brought down the plane. Rick Davis is in London now, and he's monitoring the news conference. Rick, what can you tell us?
Connie, we now have a brief copy of that official report. It does say directly that the British Department of Transport says a bomb blew up Pan Am Flight 103 as it flew over Scotland just a week ago. It has been established, the report says, that 2 parts of the metal luggage pallet framework show conclusive evidence of a detonating high explosive. The explosive residue recovered from the debris have been positively identified and are consistent with the use of high-performance plastic explosives. Other evidence collected, in particular that from the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder and from the wreckage trail on the ground, has led to the preliminary conclusion that the explosion took place shortly after the aircraft crossed over the Scottish border at 31,000 feet. They say much investigative work remains to be done to establish the nature of the explosive device. But experts in the study of terrorists and their tactics believe it was a large explosive device, possibly between 20 and 40 pounds of plastic explosives. The question now, who placed the bomb? Depending on what type of explosives was used, that may be possible to find out. Explosives do leave a certain forensic fingerprint that can often be traced to the manufacturer and the purchaser. But at this time, the only public comments are brief. The authorities say it was a bomb that caused the explosion aboard the 747 that caused it to crash on the village of Lockerbie in a ball of flame. Connie?
Thank you. Rick Davis reporting from London. Now, Robert Hager, who has been investigating the cause of this crash, is in Washington. Bob, what can you tell us based on you've been listening to what Rick Davis had to report? What can you tell us?
Well, that's a nice bit of detective work by the British investigators, methodically gone about with the collection of the wreckage. I think the view from here was that, always was, that we would find an answer to this crash and that it wouldn't take too long simply because there was so much wreckage on the ground there. So that's been the way they've gone about it, simply to collect that wreckage. And then when they found their first clues 2 days ago, that they had some that looked like it had fragments in it from a bomb, that is shrapnel sort of evidence, they sent it immediately to the lab, to the British Defense Ministry's special lab for explosives analysis, and there they finally have come up with the answers today. It'll also be interesting to think about the implications for airport security, because this new form of explosive, the plastique explosives, are very difficult to detect as they go through security machines. So now there'll be, in addition to trying to find out who did it, a big effort to see how the explosives slip through security and what we ought to do about that in terms of better security devices.
Bob, as Rick Davis had reported, he said that some bombs can leave a forensic fingerprint. Are you aware of this type of phenomenon and that type of theory?
Sure. The thing with a plastic sort of explosive is that it's malleable. To say plastic does not mean it's a polymer or a plastic. It's made up of basically nitrogen, as most explosives are. So plastic simply refers to the fact that you can mold it, and therefore you make it harder to find in an airport metal detector or the X-ray device at the airport. But it's still, when you get it in a lab, again, because nitrogen is a heavy component of all explosives, you look for nitrogen, and that's what they would have been doing at Hallstatt.
All right, Robert Hager, thank you very much. John Dancy is at the State Department, and 2 weeks before the crash, the U.S. Embassy in Finland was warned by a telephone caller that a bomb attack might be carried out against a Pan Am flight from Frankfurt, and that Pan Am flight did originate out of Frankfurt. Now, at that time, the United States government warned its embassies and the airlines and the airports about the bomb threat, but the flying public was never warned and was never told of the threat. John Dancy is at the State Department now. John, what can you tell us?
Well, first of all, Connie, the State Department and U.S. officials have fairly well ruled out the possibility that that call to the embassy in Helsinki, Finland, had anything at all to do with this crash. And they have also ruled out 2 phone calls made some hours after the crash by 2 groups claiming to be terrorist organizations which claimed responsibility for it. While they've not totally ruled it out, they say it's highly unlikely that that had anything to do with it. Now, the State Department, of course, has been watching developments, and a U.S. official told me this morning, however, that there are no plans for Secretary of State Schultz to cut short his vacation as of the moment and return here to Washington. There are also no plans to try to get a statement out of Yasser Arafat of the PLO saying that, no, we didn't have any responsibility for it. As you recall, one of the conditions of beginning a dialogue with the PLO on the part of the United States was that the PLO not engage in any terrorist activities. And Arafat, of course, renounced terrorism. The United States, of course, wanted to know if Arafat and the PLO were responsible in any way for any terrorist acts in the future. That, of course, could put a damper on the talks with the PLO. Arafat, shortly after the crash, put out a statement saying that if it was a crash, he condemned it. The State Department appears now to be satisfied with that. They are not pressing Arafat for any sort of further statement. One thing that has to be considered here, of course, Connie, is that this may not ultimately have been a terrorist attack. It might have been, as somebody said, somebody trying to get even with his wife or his mother-in-law, and not a terrorist act at all. That possibility cannot be discounted. The Senate Intelligence Committee has not yet even been briefed fully on what has gone on in this crash investigation. And in the final analysis, we just may not ever know precisely who was responsible for this. Even if intelligence agencies know, they could not go to court because that would involve letting us know something about their operatives and their methods in finding this out. In fact, security between the United States, security arrangements between the United States and other countries are pretty good. And airport security is considered to be fairly good right now. And we may just ultimately be in a position where nothing much can be done about this, and we may never know who caused it. Connie?
John, I think what isn't clear to some people is how the call from Finland could have been discredited, totally discredited, according to your sources and to the FBI.
Apparently, the Finnish government had other calls from the same person. He is known to the Finnish government, and they simply believe that he is unbalanced or makes phone calls like this on a regular basis, and so they don't believe that he had any connection with the Abu Nidal group.
Despite the coincidence.
Right, that's right, despite the coincidence.
All right, thank you very much. John Dancy reporting from the State Department. With us now is Michael Yardley, an anti-terrorist expert in our London bureau. Mr. Yardley, Is it a myth that airport security really can counteract terrorist activity?
Yes, I think it is, because in this case, whatever the final result, and I think we can say almost now with 95% certainty that this was a case of terrorism, but whatever the result, security cannot be the answer.
May I stop you for a minute? You say 95% that it is an act of terrorism. What makes you believe that?
Because no other explanation is consistent with the facts. We have an aircraft that was on track, that had just checked in on radar, that suddenly vanishes off the screen. It's most unlikely it was a structural fault. Only one other 747 went down with a structural fault. That was the Japan Airlines flight. And in that case, there was 20 minutes for distress calls and the like. There's no other explanation that fits these facts. And of course, there was a warning that there would be an attack on this route. No, I think this clearly is a case of terrorism. But what we haven't yet managed to achieve is scientific certainty of the fact that it was a case of terrorism. But coming back to your first point, the fact of the matter is, what happens after incidents like this is we go on a security witch hunt. We try and pin the blame on someone. We try and find the fault with Frankfurt security, with Heathrow security. The fact of the matter is, the purpose of terrorism is to frighten people. It's not the dead who are actually the intended victims of the terrorist. It's us the public. They want to frighten us into putting pressure on our government. So when we conceive of a strategy for dealing with terrorism, what we must do is not inadvertently create more psychological casualties. Now, Terry Waite said to me just before he was kidnapped, the problem with the sort of airport security we have at the moment is it makes everyone suspect. And in that way, we're actually doing the work of the terrorist for the terrorist. Even if you introduced Israeli-style security on every flight, and you couldn't do it because it would bring international airline operations to a grinding halt.
But I think the public would disagree with you. I think they would say you can try and place as much security as you possibly can to make it safe for the flying public. And if it delays flights, and if it delays any, or if it cancels flights, people are willing to put up with it.
I think that's a very good point, but I think to a degree the public have been misled. Because the fact of the matter is even if you closed down the airport as far as the terrorist was concerned, so it was utterly impossible to introduce an individual terrorist hijacker or a bomb onto a flight, all that would happen is that terrorism would shift to the perimeter fence, to a cruise liner, to a shopping district, because the essential problem of terrorism, frustrated aspiration and a lack of political voice, hasn't been dealt with. So although perhaps the public wants to hear that there is some security magic pill to combat terrorism, the truth of the matter is that there is not.
So you actually believe that there was no slip-up in security in our Washington Bureau who's been following the investigation. Bob?
Connie, I think it's also interesting to think about where that bomb might have been, and I have a model here of a 747 with some idea of what they think happened. There's speculation now, and this could be outdated by what the British will say, but I know this was the theory as of yesterday, is that an explosive device right in here in the forward cargo hold would be consistent with the way they found the wreckage, particularly because they found this cockpit portion of the plane sheared off just like that. And that's the sort of thing you'd expect from an explosive there. So if the bag were in that cargo hold right under first class, that would also be the place where it would do the most damage, because when you blow away the cockpit, you've got the plane. Also, another interesting thing here, now being able to say what the cause was, now investigators know which way to go from here on. Until now, they didn't know whether to go with a structural team or the sorts of investigators that investigate terrorism and explosives. But the NTSB here had all kinds of experts standing by in case they were to find it was structural failure, where they'd get on planes and go out there right away, because the implications for all the 747s around the world would be tremendous. Now that we know it's explosives, the FBI will be in on others.
All right, thank you very much, Robert Hager. Once again, the crash did kill all 259 people on board, and at least 11 people are missing and presumed dead on the ground. The search is continuing in Lockerbie for more victims. Many bodies have been found, but as yet unidentified. The first body of a victim of the crash of Pan Am Flight 103 will be arriving at New York's Kennedy Airport this afternoon, aboard a Pan Am flight, a New Jersey victim. The search continues both on land and undersea. Later this afternoon, aboard another Pan Am flight, 4 more victims will be returned to Kennedy Airport, a couple from Ohio and their 2 grandchildren from Warren, Michigan. Once again, to wrap up, British officials have determined that the cause of the crash of Pan Am Flight 103 was a bomb. And we will have more on that tonight on NBC Nightly News.
This has been an NBC News special report. We now rejoin the program already in progress.
Yeah. Well, we don't know yet. Okay, here we go. This is a little-known holiday.
Oh, okay.
Ready? Okay, go.
Box. It's a box. It's a box. Boxing. Champ. Boxing. Boxing in the ring. Boxing Day.
Boxing Day is it. Boxing Day is the day after Christmas. And where is it? In England and in Australia. Yeah.
That was difficult.
Yeah.
Boxing Day, okay.
I've heard of that one.
Is it an English one?
It's English in Australia, and it's the day after Christmas.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Because they put it back in the box and bring it back and exchange it?
Today was subpoenaed to testify at the criminal trial of his former White House aide, Oliver North. North is accused in connection with the Iran-Contra scandal. His lawyers made the request. It would be an unprecedented event for a president to personally appear at a criminal trial. The trial is scheduled for January 31st. NBC's law correspondent Carl Stern is in Washington. Carl, was this a surprise?
Connie, it was not. North's lawyers had indicated in court on December 21st that they would be subpoenaing 25 or 26 individuals, including those who would be leaving town on January 20th. Obviously, that was a reference to President Reagan. But don't jump to the conclusion merely because he's been subpoenaed that they will actually put him on the stand. This could still be a sort of a pretrial tactic.
Carl, I'm sure this raises significant constitutional questions. Does the president really have a choice in the matter?
Well, he doesn't. Chief Justice Marshall, in a famous opinion in 1907 in a case involving Aaron Burr, said that every man is entitled to the president's evidence. In that case, it was President Jefferson. Monroe was subpoenaed in 1818. President Nixon was subpoenaed once. The rule is generally that they must obey a subpoena. And once President Reagan is out of office, he would have even less of a basis for resisting one.
Well, the subpoena also asks for some personal records. Is it likely that he'll turn them over?
He will have to turn them over unless the judge rules that the information sought is irrelevant or classified.
All right. Thank you very much. Carl Stern reporting from Washington. 2 new reports of airline bomb threats emerged today. An anonymous caller saying he represents the group that bombed Pan Am Flight 103 warned of another attack unless the U.S. expels the son of the former Shah of Iran, who lives outside Washington, D.C. That threat came from the Guardians of the Islamic Revolution. U.S. officials do not believe that group was responsible for the Pan Am disaster. The other threat by a Palestinian group was made a week ago, but revealed today. And as State Department correspondent John Dancy reports, it is being taken seriously.
Airlines operating in Asia have tightened security. This after receiving a warning that a Palestinian group threatened to blow up or hijack an airliner somewhere in the Pacific. The warning came from the Indian government and was passed from airline to airline in the Far East. Here in the U.S., State Department spokeswoman Phyllis Oakley said the department was aware of the reported warning, which she said was one of hundreds received by the airlines.
The FAA, as you know, intelligence community, law enforcement community, they all analyze these and determine what the appropriate measures are.
In this case, the FAA took the warning seriously, telling airlines on Christmas Eve, although no U.S. carriers were specifically identified as targets, this information is disseminated as a precautionary measure. But as customary, there was no public warning. The warning said guerrillas loyal to this man, known as Abu Musa, would attack a plane in the Pacific area before January 10th. In Los Angeles today, as Japan Airlines Flight 61 was boarding for Tokyo, there were no signs of stepped-up security. But airline officials say that's because they increased security months ago, long before the bombing of Pan Am 103.
We have our security guards at in front of our counters here to inspect any suspicious people that may be in the area.
Told of the warning, passengers seemed fatalistic.
Every time I get on the plane, I think about it for the first 10, 15 minutes, and then I try to put it out of my mind because it'll just drive you crazy, but you gotta fly.
I just couldn't let it affect me and then still try and maintain my jobs.
Whether the warning was real or not, it has forced some airlines to alter their normal routine, and it has escalated the war of nerves between terrorists and the West.
John Dansley, NBC News, at the State Department.
Coming up on NBC Nightly News, with New Year's Eve a day away, David Burrington takes a look at drunk driving nationwide. The news is encouraging. And a look back at 1988, the people and events that shaped the world. A video memory of the year.
This holiday message is brought to you by Maytag, the dependability people.
I used to take aspirin for minor arthritis pain, but it sometimes upset my stomach, so I switched.
In October. New York Governor Mario Cuomo today refused to grant clemency to Jean Harris. Harris, once headmistress of a private girls' school, has served almost 8 years in jail for murdering her lover, Herman Tarnauer, the Scarsdale diet doctor. Harris is serving a 15-year to life sentence.
Help knock out sinus
The
pain.
worries about drunk driving. Will tomorrow night's merrymaking lead to even more than the expected number of deaths? Or will the campaign to reduce drinking behind the wheel slow the death rate? NBC's David Burrington assesses the national effort and finds some encouraging answers.
Most encouraging, the number of fatal crashes attributed to drunk drivers has dropped 17% in 6 years. For teenagers, it's dropped 34%. These figures from the Centers for Disease Control.
Hey, Don, this here is called a preliminary breath test. It gives me some kind of idea how much you've had to drink.
The reason, according to an insurance study, is tougher new laws adopted in the early 1980s. That includes tougher blood alcohol tests, mandatory jail terms, and immediate suspension of driver's licenses of those arrested for drunk driving. Mothers against drunk driving are encouraged.
People now see that these are not accidents, they're crashes and they're crimes. I think the American public is coming to terms with that.
But MAD insists more should be done, especially lowering blood alcohol limits for motorists. 3 states, including Oregon, have lowered the legal limit to 8% from the 10% nationwide standard. The American Medical Association wants it dropped to 5%. A pilot program in Oregon permits judges to require convicted drunk drivers to install breathalyzers in their cars. If the driver's been drinking, the car won't start.
Won't do anything.
Individuals are also coming up with new ideas. In San Francisco, a towing company will cart home both the car and the drinking driver for only $10. In Chicago, Gene Sage is spearheading a nationwide campaign for restaurateurs to keep an eye on drinking customers. This is what he tells his bartenders to say.
We value you as a customer. We don't want you to lose your life or your license or kill anybody else. So we are going to take care of you.
And in San Diego this weekend, teenagers will be offering free rides to youngsters who feel they're too drunk to drive, doing their part to keep the roads safe. David Burrington, NBC News, Los Angeles.
The Mercedes-Benz, it's sleek and it's plush, but the 1986 model is definitely not fuel efficient. The U.S. Transportation Department today announced that the German luxury car manufacturer paid a record $20 million fine because the 1986 Mercedes guzzles far too much gas. America's teenagers are looking forward to a prosperous future. A survey of more than 2,000 of them by Teenage Research Unlimited showed that 92% believe they will earn more money than their parents. A companion market study showed parents are spending more money on their children to compensate for the limited time they're spending with them. At Union today, the Gorbachev regime delivered a most powerful condemnation of a former Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev. A court convicted Yuri Trebanov, Brezhnev's son-in-law, and sentenced him to 12 years in prison for taking more than $100,000 in bribes. NBC's Sandy Gilmore reports on this judgment of the long Brezhnev era, now seen as a time of corruption and stagnation.
It was a long fall for Yuri Churbanov, a man once on top of the Soviet world, married to Leonid Brezhnev's daughter, rising from junior policeman to become first deputy head of the Interior Ministry, and by courtroom accounts a very wealthy man, now found guilty of taking bribes and abusing his former office. The sentence.
Чурбанова Юрия Михайловича на основании статьи 152, части 2 Уголовного кодекса Узбекской ССР.
The man really on trial here has been Churbanov's father-in-law, Brezhnev, who President Gorbachev has blamed for years of corruption and economic stagnation. A year ago, workmen began removing Brezhnev's name from the public eye in a campaign to discredit him. So much for Moscow's Brezhnev district, Moscow's Brezhnev Square, now both renamed. Yesterday, the final insult, as officials ordered all references to Brezhnev removed, including this plaque at his old apartment house. In the trial, Churbanov's defense lawyer had tried to argue his client shouldn't be convicted just for being related to Brezhnev. But for Churbanov and the whole Brezhnev era, the verdict was guilty as charged. Sandy Gilmore, NBC News, Moscow.
There is another story of corruption tonight from Japan. It's about a growing scandal involving businessmen, politicians, and today it claimed another casualty in the government. Justice Minister Takeshi Hasegawa was forced to resign just 3 days after being appointed to clean up the scandal. Hasegawa admitted that he received political donations from a company that courted politicians by offering them cheap stock. A new justice minister was quickly appointed. Another East Bloc nation faced economic and political chaos today. The Prime Minister of Yugoslavia and his entire cabinet resigned. Premier Branko Mikulic said he stepped down because Parliament refused to pass austerity laws the nation's lenders demanded in return for continued financial support. In Nicaragua tonight, they're talking about a winning lottery ticket that someone mistakenly threw away. For 2 days, hundreds of people have been searching the Managua city dump in search of what they consider a fortune. The value of the ticket, $1,300. We approach the new year. We look back on this year, 1988, a chronicle of people and events to be remembered as seen through the eyes of producer Frank Schambecker and editor George Liebert.
Go out there and win one for the giver.
8 years ago, George Bush and I said to the American people, read my lips.
If he truly believes that J. Danforth Quayle is qualified to be one heartbeat away from the presidency,
I may not be on the ticket, but I'm qualified. That's what I know.
When it comes to the future of the United States, Michael Dukakis will be the real Terminator.
What this administration has done on defense is says, ready, fire, aim.
Oh, dead. We had him, got it. That was a dead on.
An Iranian passenger airliner was shot down by U.S. naval forces over the Persian Gulf this morning. All 290 passengers and crew were killed.
Minimize the tragedy. We all know that it was a tragedy.
Of course it's an accident waiting to happen. We must know that we will protect our ships. If they threaten us, they'll pay a price.
I now call upon the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Republic of Iraq to observe a ceasefire.
The Afghan people themselves have a chance to determine their own future, free of Soviet forces.
The PLO were not partners, they're not partners now, and they'll never be partners for any negotiations.
We will strike at terrorist targets wherever they are.
We totally renounce all forms of terrorism. We mean the right of all parties to exist, including the State of Palestine, Israel, and other neighbors.
and Greg. Dear friends, we have resumed the journey that we promised to continue for you.
I just don't know how he does it or whether he gets a hypnotist or something, but he does something.
Money, money, money!
The total retail value of all illicit drugs sold in the United States of America is somewhere around $100 billion.
If you're a casual drug user, you're an accomplice to murder.
Drug pushers have invaded the United States.
Noriega is today, and has been for some years, the godfather.
There's no basis for any sleaze factor.
Can't figure out how anybody can figure that I'm a criminal.
When I came here, I was a human being. Now I'm just a number.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
I thought that was some kind of stunt they had pulled. Then I realised what they had done.
When I looked over the sea, I saw nothing but sky.
I heard this horrible sound and the whole sky just lit up.
Punish firmly, decisively those who did this.
It's beyond anything in one's experience. I mean, just before Christmas, there must be some sick people about in this world.
What we're dealing with in Yellowstone is a place which has been already radically altered by ourselves. But we can't simply leave it to nature to take care of it.
We're very proud of all of you and what you're doing up there. A great many people are praying for all of you.
We want clean, healthy water for ourselves and our children, and we're not going to take anything less.
It's a lie! It's a sham! It won't work!
People are dying. This is an emergency. It's a war. Let's treat it like a war.
The number of new AIDS cases during this year will likely equal the total number of cases which had occurred from the mid-1970s through 1987.
In this proud land, we grew up strong. We were wanted.
We need help in here. I'm asking for help.
We're not all drunks or junkies or just most of us are just normal people that had some bad times.
Don't give up, 'cause you have friends. Don't give up, you're not the only one. Don't give up, 'cause somewhere there's a place where you belong.
It is sad, really sad. After 70 years of building, they are wiped out in 4 seconds.
Children, women, all of them are under this building, so help us, please.
Do you recognize President Reagan?
Radi Sia Nia Naya Tara Pilsa.
We find ourselves standing like this.
Extraordinary things have happened. A president of the United States and a future president of the United States and a president of the Soviet Union standing together in New York Harbor under the protective gaze of the Statue of Liberty. We have walked a long way together to clear a path for peace.
And that's the year's news in capsule. And for tonight, Tom Brokaw will be back next week. I'm Connie Chung in New York. I'll see you again on Sunday night. Thank you for joining us, and for all of us at NBC News, have a safe and happy New Year.
Celebrate your holiday season with the joy and warmth of The Sound of Music, starring Julie Andrews in her most captivating role. The beauty, the romance, the triumph. Winner of 5 Academy Awards, The Sound of Music, a holiday treat Friday.
Just ahead on Channel 2 News, a controversial law.
Conclusion that the explosion took place shortly after the aircraft crossed over the Scottish border at 31,000 feet. They say much investigative work remains to be done to establish the nature of the explosive device. But experts in the study of terrorists and their tactics believe it was a large explosive device, possibly between 20 and 40 pounds of plastic explosives. The question now, who placed the bomb? Depending on what type of explosives was used, that may be possible to find out. Explosives do leave a certain forensic fingerprint that can often be traced to the manufacturer and the purchaser. But at this time, the only public comments are brief. The authorities say it was a bomb that caused the explosion aboard the 747 that caused it to crash on the village of Lockerbie in a ball of flame. Connie?
Thank you. Rick Davis reporting from London. Now, Robert Hager, who has been investigating the cause of this crash, is in Washington. Bob, what can you tell us based on you've been listening to what Rick Davis had to report? What can you tell us?
Well, that's a nice bit of detective work by the British investigators.
What am I going to do with a letter of apology? I don't want a letter. I want a refund.
British officials are expected to announce that they have determined the cause of the crash of Pan Am Flight 103 last Wednesday. Sources tell NBC News that examination of a suitcase and pieces of wreckage lead to the conclusion that a bomb brought down the plane. Rick Davis is in London now, and he's monitoring the news conference. Rick, what can you tell us?
Connie, we now have a brief copy of that official report. It does say directly that the British Department of Transport says a bomb blew up Pan Am Flight 103 as it flew over Scotland just a week ago. It has been established, the report says, that 2 parts of the metal luggage pallet framework show conclusive evidence of a detonating high explosive. The explosive residue recovered from the debris have been positively identified and are consistent with the use of high-performance plastic explosives. Other evidence collected, in particular that from the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder and from the wreckage trail on the ground, has led to the preliminary...
The scene here is one of horror and bewilderment. No one seems to know exactly what happened, but certainly at least 4 houses have disappeared in a smoke and flame. At the present moment, rescue services are trying to take injured and dead to the town hall where a refugee centre has been set up. A helicopter is circling the scene at the moment, and police, ambulances and firemen are still tackling flames in an area of the town called Sherwood Crescent, where the houses were demolished. Apparently the aircraft has hit a hill about 3 miles from Lockerbie, and then wreckage has been strewn as it travelled the distance to the town and landed on the houses and some other property.
Bert Houston of the BBC with an eyewitness report of what's going on there, and it does sound like a scene of great horror indeed as the Pan Am flight, a 747, flight number 103.
Investigators methodically gone about with the collection of the wreckage. I think the view from here was that, always was, that we would find an answer to this crash and that it wouldn't take too long simply because there was so much wreckage on the ground there. So that's been the way they've gone about it, simply to collect that wreckage. Then when they found their first clues 2 days ago that they had some that looked like it had fragments in it from a bomb, that is shrapnel sort of evidence, they sent it immediately to the lab, to the British Defense Ministry's special lab for explosives analysis, and there they finally have come up with the answers today. It'll also be interesting to think about the implications for airport security, because this new form of explosive, the plastique explosives, are very difficult to detect as they go through security machines. So now there'll be, in addition to trying to find out who did it, a big effort to see how the explosives slip through security and what we ought to do about that in terms of better security devices.
Bob,
crashed with a great explosion tonight on the border between England and Scotland in the town of Lockerbie. He also mentioned the village of Sherwood Crescent, saying that it appeared that 4 houses had simply disappeared in smoke and in flames. There were earlier reports of cars on fire as well on a nearby highway that has now been closed. That's all the information that we have at this hour. About 250 people on board, perhaps as many as 258, including 3 children. Pan Am Flight 103, a 747, headed for New York for the holidays, no doubt. It went down 303 miles outside of London. We'll have a complete wrap-up tonight on NBC Nightly News, and as additional information becomes available to us, we'll report that to you on this NBC station. For now, I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News, New York.
This has been an NBC News special report. We now rejoin the program already in progress.
KPRC-TV, Houston. We now join our regularly scheduled program.